Welcome to Explore, Explain. This is a long-form video and podcast series sharing conversations with data visualization designers and developers from around the world. Each episode explores the detailed hidden thinking behind a single project or a series of related works to explain the what, the why, and the how of the design process. So let's jump in to today's episode with your host, Andy Kirk.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Explore Explain. My name's Andy Kirk and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all out there. In today's episode, I'm delighted to welcome Natalie Erdem. Natalie, it's great to see you again. Thank you very much for your time today. For the benefit of the viewers and listeners out there, can you give us all just a brief intro for yourself and also for the studio from which you come today?
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. Yes, so I'm Natalie Erdem. I'm one of the partners at 2N, which is a data visualization studio based in New York City. So our focus is on the visual communication of data, and our expertise really is in figuring out ways for our clients' audiences to understand complicated, complex data in a very easy and intuitive way. So me personally, I've been with the company for 10 years. I started as an employee and then I worked my way up and I ended up being an owner of the company along with my business partner, Herman Jigner. So he's the creative director of our studio and I am basically manage the entire studio. So I'm the managing partner, head of new business, head of product development.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And in today's episode, we're going to talk about a project that I don't know if you would see this internally as such, but certainly from the outside, it feels like one of the big ones that you've gone through in this last 10 years, 15 years, whatever time frame you want to look at it. And this is the development of the MSNBC big board used initially for the US midterm elections in 2018, I think from memory, and then in subsequent elections since then. And as we were talking off air before we start recording, this could be something that we spend hours, maybe even a couple of days talking about. There's so much to unpack. So we're going to try and fit all that into about an hour, which means I'm actually going to focus more today, I think, on the real hidden stuff that really kind of characterizes what seems to be a very unique visualization project, which is to develop something for TV. And I think it's a really fascinating platform. It's a whole different set of nuances and contexts that we're going to sort of pick through. So let's start at the beginning with the origin story. How did this project come about? How did it land on your desks, on your email? What was the sort of first point at which this could be a thing that you might pursue working on?
Yeah. So we had worked previously with a data viz freelancer named EJ Fox. He's like, he's around in the industry. He's a great guy. He's really, really talented. So we had worked with him on a previous project. And there were, at the time, there was this, now I think the Data Viz Society has taken over the jobs board, but there was this
Yeah,
Google Groups. I
I
think it was
remember it
run by
fondly.
Lynn.
Yes, Lynn Cheney. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. And so, as a studio, I'm always looking for new work, right? So I would check it periodically. And, a lot of times they were looking for freelancers or, individuals. So if it was something that seemed interesting and something that would fit our skill set, I would, reach out to whoever posted and say, hey, are you interested in hiring a studio? So I saw EJ was working in-house at MSNBC and he had posted, we're looking for data viz developers to work on the upcoming election. So I was like, immediately, like, that piqued my interest. I'm like, oh, I wonder what he is doing. Like, it's probably really cool. So I just emailed him and he was like, hey, thanks so much for reaching out, blah, blah, blah. We're looking to build out our team internally, but I'll let you know if we are interested in hiring a studio.
right.
So then 2 weeks later, I was in West Virginia visiting my family, and he called me and he just was like, "When can you start?" So, so I think they had a very immediate. I learned that they had a very immediate need because this was April of 2018, and they were planning to migrate everything from the VizRT technology that they had into browser-based technology using
Right.
either we originally created the map like an SVG map, but they needed to create some kind of mapping tool and get it ready for air by November.
I mean, what's your reaction at
So
that point? I mean, you know at this point, I guess, how busy you are, how committed you are to other things. Is your reaction
yeah,
immediately, yes, of course, and I'll work out how later, or is it more, let me think about this one?
I think one of the reasons our studio has been successful is because I'm always like, if it's exciting and interesting, I'm like, yes, we'll figure out how to do it. Like, so it seemed like a huge opportunity and something that we were really excited to be a part of. So I just said yes. And originally they just wanted design work. So that's how we kind of got in.
Got you.
That's how we got in our foot in the door for it. And it ended up being such an incredible partnership, and we worked with them for so long. And it wasn't just, the initial scope, I think was like 10 weeks of design work or something like that. So yeah. So anyhow, that answers
Yeah, it
that
does. I mean,
question.
I'm just
Yeah.
wondering also then, especially with the sense that it did evolve into a different design development partnership, as you kind of expressed there. What did MSNBC have before this? And you spot there almost like a some sort of transition from what was there to something new. Were they coming from the base of we need to completely revamp our offering for this election, this flagship event that takes place? Or was it just a natural, the previous things run its course and it's just a natural stage at which point we revisit and nudge it forward? What was the kind of the context of what you were sort of building upon, I guess?
So they had a technology called VizRT, and it was when it came out, I think it was like the greatest thing ever, and a lot of broadcast news used it. At this point, everyone was switching to browser based, right? Because it was more streamlined. There were a lot of things that were easier about doing that, right? Once
Right.
you did the lift of building it out, right? So I think it really was EJ's vision, like those conversations happened before we came in to
Mm,
the project, but I really think it was his vision to say like, hey, let's take this into the browser and let's create, something that is easy for the talent to use. We can modify easily, we can update, we can have the data filtered in. So it was really his vision, but the interesting part about it was that made it not necessarily just a broadcast project, right? Then now it's a digital project. So the digital team and the broadcast team are very like siloed.
right.
So at that time they were anyways. So that was quite interesting to kind of bring those two teams together. Like I remember our first meeting, there was like 25 people in it. So there were all these people from the digital team, right? That are used to working in a digital way, right? So, okay, we want to do something, let's create a ticket. It'll get done in this sprint.
But yeah.
The broadcast team is like, so we're gonna need that tomorrow morning for air. So we need you to fix it. And the digital team's like, that you can't fix that by tomorrow morning. So they worked in very different ways.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then we had in that meeting, we also had the talent, which was like Steve Kornacki, Chuck Todd, and then all their producers. And then Mark Greenstein, who was basically the head of content for, I think, for everything on MSNBC. I'm not
Right.
sure, but definitely for elections. So yeah, because the election is kind of like their Super Bowl, right? It's like the
Yeah,
highest
yeah.
viewership that they have. So yeah, so we had this huge meeting and there were all these people there, and it was kind of funny because I didn't really realize that there were going to be, 25 people in the meeting. I thought it was going to be like 4.
Yeah.
So we show up and I'm like, oh, okay. I get in over my head, you know.
I can imagine it takes about an hour to get around all the intros as well, and they're all trying to work out who they are simultaneously.
Oh, totally. Yeah. But since we knew EJ and he had been working with them for a while, he vouched for us, and
Yeah.
we had a great, we had an immediate bond because of that, right? So
I think that's really important, especially when you've got such a big group of people involved, because I kind of, in my sort of notes for this conversation, I was sort of making the distinction in my mind about the important thing that's different between working with somebody and working for somebody. in a sense
Mm.
that the working with is just the sort of day-to-day contact, but the working for somebody is ultimately the person who gives you the thumbs up to say that's done. They're the kind of authority. They're the ones who you are, I guess, seeking to impress, and that's further not complicated, but further sort of branched out when the main guy you are serving, Steve Konaki, who, for context, and you can elaborate a bit on Steve very shortly.
Mm.
He's a celebrity and a celebrated presenter and driver and orator of election nights. He's also simultaneously the what we might consider the typical audience for this work, but then he's the user of the work to serve his own audience. So there's so many different people layers of this onion that must be great because there's lots of people to work with, but must be hard sometimes to just nail down who you're serving, who's got the input, who's got the influence, who's interfering, who's distracting. It's quite complicated, right?
Yeah, it was very complicated to navigate that. And I think you need to have very strong project management in order to succeed in that type of environment, which we did have. We had for MSNBC, there was this guy, Michael Small, who was the project manager, and then I was working for our team. And we worked very closely together, and we had to be very goal oriented
Mm.
because we had such a short timeline. So that was difficult to navigate because we had several layers that we were working with and quite a few unknowns, right? So we were very excited to do a touch screen, but we'd done big data displays, but we never done a big data display that had one user and millions of viewers and it's being videotaped,
Yeah.
so we were like, out of our element for sure. But I do think the reason that it worked and the reason that we do consider it one of our most successful, well, one of our biggest known and very
Mm.
successful projects is because what we bring to the table is an expertise that they didn't necessarily have in house.
Right.
They know everything about elections. I mean, we would call it into the weeds, right? So they're talking about things where I consider myself like an educated American citizen, and I vote and I care, and they'd be talking about things that I was like, I have no idea what they're talking about. I'm gonna have to Google this later. So that was amazing though, because like you said, we were working with them. So there was a huge team, including their internal design team that we worked with, and they were thrilled to have us.
Okay.
So sometimes when you
Well, that was my next
come
question.
in,
Was
yeah.
wondering about the kind of potential designy conflicts that could happen there.
Well, they had done, so sometimes we would come up with a design and then they'd say, yeah, we did that in, 2016. Yeah, we did that in whatever year. Because a lot of people had been there for a long time and working on elections for a long time.
Yeah.
And that really worked as an asset for us, right? Because it made the app the best it could be, right? Because
Right.
we would try things that maybe had already been done, but then we would try things that hadn't been done and they'd be excited about that. And then that question was, well, does that resonate with the audience? Like, will they be able to understand it through a screen at this granularity, with this color
Mm.
contrast?
Mm.
So all those questions came up like along the way, right? But we ultimately, it was interesting in that you're working for a corporation, really, right? So there is that top down, um, you know,
Hierarchy. Yeah.
aspect
Yeah.
where, yeah, hierarchy, where the president of NBC can say, I hate that, get rid of it, and then all the work
Yeah.
you did gets tossed out, right? But for the most part, they loved what we did. We worked so well together and we had a really, really positive experience. There were a couple times when it was like, okay, Andy doesn't like this, get rid of it.
Yeah.
Um, or like another network would come out with something and they'd say, we want that. We want all the candidates' heads in circles,
Well,
or
that was my next
whatever.
question actually, because from a distance where I am, I'm aware of MSNBC and obviously the other news outlets. CNN is perhaps the most accessible news channel from afar. But
Mhm.
2018, this has come on the aftermath of the 2016 bombshell
Yeah.
in some respects, and certainly for those of us in the viz world, there was a lot of kind of introspection after that about, how did news media in general portray matters like probabilities and uncertainty? You know,
Mhm.
this was the outcome. How did we miss the visuals that made that clear as a possible outcome? So was the notion of competitiveness with other news media and a desire to be distinct, a desire to emulate, to not what they do and to do a bit more what they do, was that part of the conversation, kind of early on in this process about perhaps not just a motivating factor, but something that you're trying to sort of lead towards as well?
Yeah. So, I mean, they're all competing, right? So that's
Yeah.
a fact. And because of what had happened in the Gore Bush election, where the news networks had to go before Congress and all of that, there have been regulations put in place, right? So all the networks receive the same data. It's pooled to get,
Okay.
like, they pay for it together. And I didn't know any of this when we started, and I found this fascinating. And then each network has a decision desk, right? And so the
Right.
decision desk is isolated, and they're not supposed to watch the other networks and see when they call elections, right? So if it's like Arizona and they're gonna, Fox might call it, right, based on the percentage of votes that have come in. So MSNBC might not call it, right? So the
Right.
decision desk makes that decision, and there's a team of people in there, and they run their models on the data, but they all receive the same data.
I see.
So polling data, I think, I'm not sure about polling data if they use the same polling data or not. That can be a little bit more varied, I think, but
Mm,
I do think they might go in on that together as
mm,
well. So because of that, because they're isolated, so we did get to go into the decision desk area when it wasn't election night
right.
and test out the app in there and have
Yeah.
them looking at it and see what, and see what they do in there. And it was just really cool and really interesting to understand the election process and how these networks work. But yeah, as far as the design process goes, and like before we got to using the app on air and before election night, um, for sure they're watching what everybody else is doing,
Yeah.
and they, not the decision desk, but like the network itself.
Yeah.
And they want something that's going to differentiate them. And
Mm,
luckily for MSNBC, they have Steve Kornacki, and he's a huge differentiator,
got
right?
you.
Because he's this kind of I remember, I think it was 2018, but it might have been the next election. This woman from SNL, she did all these tweets about him, and she's like, "This is who I want my election information from." And he kind of became like a national treasure,
Yeah.
right? And he's just honestly like such a nice guy, and he's so knowledgeable, and he really cares, and he knows all the history of the elections in the US, and he knows what stories he wants to tell. So I think
Right.
working with somebody that really has a passion for this and really is invested and knows what kind of stories they want to tell is such a benefit to
Yeah.
creating something that is interesting for the audience. So yeah,
And
I could keep going.
no, no, and we need to, because there's so much to this, and I think one of the interesting things that I think you mentioned there was obviously he's the differentiator potentially. He's the not just the charisma, but also just the potency of the information exchange to the viewer. Was it always therefore going to be something that he drove with a big touchscreen panel alongside him? Was it ever going to be something that, in a sense, he's a presenter, but there's other people are driving it, behind a desktop that's on screen? Was it ever going to be a green screen type of setting? What was how quickly was it going to just be this big sort of touchscreen panel that you were stood next to?
Yeah, it was always going to be that. It was always going to be the election board, the big board. And behind the scenes, the producers help with creating like hits.
Right,
So there is an admin tool that they already had that they use for that. And then to support the election map, we created like a behind the scenes tool called the Hitmaker.
right.
And so that really facilitated like easier use of the map and also integrating with other things like the stills and things like that. So that did have to be done in addition to building out all the features for the map, right?
Got you.
Which we did get into like a lot of nitty gritty because with building the map, so certain things like from election to election, congressional districts can change, right? So you have to
Right.
remap them. And then it's hard to compare historical data because the districts are different. So, we did get into a lot of like nitty gritty data problems, while we did this project and exposure to that and like larger issues like across America.
Absolutely. And I can imagine that's in a in a time pressure process that you've faced here. Clearly, you've only had the kind of phone call April, I think you mentioned. This is going live in November, and it's not even you can't shift the election until you're ready. That's a fixed fixed deadline. I mean, within that time frame, at what point would you say there was certain milestones that we have to have, version X, prototype X ready by so and so? What was the sort of first, what you might consider the first sort of stressful date point within that time frame that you thought we've got to get something for then?
So one thing that with the timeline that was challenging was you really have to do a ton of testing. So it's not, and they wanted a lot of changes. So um but it was cool because we got to go into the studio and do the testing in the studio, and sometimes we would have a producer that would like run it, would run the hit instead of Steve because he's pretty busy. And then we would run it with him as well, right? And get feedback. So we started testing it. I mean, to be honest with you, we were making changes like through October. So it was supposed to be like done in September, right? But that's kind of just not how it works in broadcast. And I do think that the digital team was like a little shaken by that because that can give you a lot of anxiety. Like if you're putting in new features or you're changing things, like it can break, right? Um, and the reason that we really needed it done in September and why that was like a big goalpost is because Steve had to use it and had to use it on air and had to practice with it, right? So we needed it to be on air before
Right.
the election. It was
Yeah.
used before the election. It was used in the run up to the election. So yeah, I don't remember the exact month that he started using it on air, if it was like August or September, but I think around that time. So as you've worked in this field for a long time, that was like a very tight turnaround. I mean, the
Absolutely.
pressure was on. It was crazy, but it was so much fun. So like nobody cared because we were so happy to be working on this.
Yeah.
You know, um,
I guess it
and it
becomes
really
like
was.
a citizen duty in a way.
I think so. And we were all really like the team that we had at the time was so interested in it.
Mm.
We had one of our developers had a political science degree. So, he was so into it and I was so into it,
Yeah.
and I just thought it was the coolest thing and, so interesting to be a part of. So yeah, but it was stressful too, because we also were working with, it wasn't just our development team, we worked with their digital team. So
Mm.
another thing we were doing that we hadn't really done before, and we've done a ton since, is our developers were working as one team with their developers. So we weren't working in a silo, we were working
Mm.
just in tandem. We were set up as like employees
Got you.
and integrated in that way so that we can move faster, right?
Yeah.
So it wasn't like, hey, 2N, build this and then we'll integrate it. It was just like everybody working together to get as much done as possible, get it tested, start testing out these features, having Steve use them, right? So yeah.
And obviously an election is predictable in some respects in terms of there's a certain degree of the sort of timing of on the evening of when certain things are going to land or
Mm-hmm.
happen or close or be counted. To a certain degree which especially through polling, you've got a certain sense of which regions, states, districts, whatever it may be, are likely to go one way or the other. But I noted on one of the videos that you did, I think it was the outlier talk that you gave last year in Porto, the sort of fundamental purpose that was kind of expressed for this work is at any given point, who is winning? Or by extension, who do you think is winning? Because it's not a knowable thing until it's finished counting.
Yeah.
And why? Why are they winning? What's the kind of story behind it? So from your point of view, kind of developing this, I guess the sort of storyboarding and the sequencing of here's something that's happened during the night. How do we visually answer that, or how do we answer that through data? I guess there's just a ton of sticky note type mapping out of journeys, questions, kind of user experience, user interface type journeys before you even get into the build. Was that fair enough?
Definitely. So when we first started, they already had all those stories outlined, right? So they
Right,
just sent us like, here's all the stories we want to tell, right?
right,
And it's a huge list. And also we were building for the midterm, but this needed to be built for the general, right?
yeah. And sorry,
So
just on
while
that,
we
Natalie,
were
sorry to interrupt. Is there a sense that the midterms, although it's still a massive event, is a notch down from the pressure and exposure of the big 4-yearly presidential election? Is that, or was it just a case of
definitely.
it just happened when it happened?
No, I mean, they didn't tell us directly
Express that,
that that
yeah,
was the case, but I definitely think it was, okay, the midterms are a safe
yeah,
bet to
yeah.
test this out on. And then it also enabled us to learn from that and be able to make modifications for the general, right? So, if you see Steve is struggling to find a certain type of data that he's
Mm,
looking for, then we make a modification, right? So that it's easier for him to access it. And there was a lot of that like back and forth. But yes, so wait, did I answer that other question? So we were building for the midterms.
Yeah, sorry, sorry, I interrupted. I broke your
That's
flow.
okay.
It was the question just about, the notion that the whole prospect is about, who is winning, who do we think is winning and why? And so this sense of sort of storyboarding and mapping out all these different routes, as you said, that you kind of had
Yes.
prescribed to you anyway, perhaps.
Yes. So one big thing, so we were working to create something for this one specific user, right? So
Mm,
his type of storytelling. So that was a different thing for us to do, right? Because usually we're building for a large user base and we're making it as intuitive as possible for as many
mm,
people as possible, right? In this case, we're not doing that at all.
yeah,
And there's hidden buttons and hidden, okay, you click the top to get back to home. Like
yeah,
that's your safety button, and just one guy needs to know that,
yeah,
or
yeah.
two or three. Like they did end up using it with other talent as well. But they didn't work with us as much or as intricately, right? Um, so yeah, so we would historical data is a big thing, right? And he uses that regularly. So we created I think I presented it in um probably both the talk. So we created this historical drawer where you just like press an arrow at the bottom and it pops out and pops out and pops out, goes back each election, right?
Right.
So if he wants to keep going back in time, he just presses one button. And then all of the election maps and big boards across the networks, they typically have like a side panel of shortcut buttons, right? So that was another big discussion because some of the team at MSNBC said, okay, the audience at home needs to be able to see those buttons and understand what these icons are. But if you look at the other apps, like they're not all doing that.
Mm.
So there was a big discussion about whether or not those needed to be visible to the audience or not. And I think initially we made them visible to the audience and then we switched it later, like maybe for the general to where it didn't need to be. Um, so
But
we didn't
I
just
think
have the
on that,
map.
sorry again to interrupt.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
think I thought it was really interesting. One of the talks that you gave, I think it was Herman who mentioned this idea of implicit and explicit interactivity. And I think he talks about the
Yeah.
anecdote of, I don't know if it's the NBC president or some senior bod. They want to be able to grasp what you're doing, or sorry, what Steve's doing on screen in a bar when the volume's down on the TV, They need to sort of
Yeah.
see the headings of the buttons or the headings of the drop-down menus. I thought that was a really fascinating insight. I'd never thought about that sense of you are almost labeling things for the muted viewer as well as Steve, who's maybe tired. He's doing a 12-hour stretch and he needs to remember where that button is. It's not just for him; it's for signaling to the audience. I think that's a really interesting, again, unique thing for a sort of a TV viz that this is.
Yes, exactly. And to have the broadcast team or to have the broadcast team be able to tell us that is why we were able to create this
Yeah.
and make it a success, because without that knowledge base, like that institutional knowledge is crucial,
Mm.
and they had done this over and over and over, and they'd seen what worked and what hadn't worked. And I do think that was a really important insight for us to understand, because we wouldn't necessarily think about that type of audience member, right? Or think
Mm.
about how it's being put on broadcast TV. We were very focused on how Steve's going to use this, right?
Mm.
Because that's what we're used to doing, right? Is
Mm.
creating a user experience um, that someone's touching or clicking
Yeah.
on, right? So, yeah, so I think it was such a collective effort, to create something to create an application that could do that.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah.
And just sort of moving on, or before we move on away from the kind of context of all this, I just wondered if there were any, looking sort of in the rear mirror at this point, were there any other things? I'm trying to think. I'll have to find a better word than things. Were there any other factors or kind of contextual circumstances that you now wish, looking back, you'd known about earlier, or had you done something similar for another project, you might have known about that thing. So we mentioned there about the idea that you might want some visual cues about what's being pressed for the viewer who's on mute. Were there any other things that emerged during this process that were like kind of, I never thought about that, that if you'd just known about it 2 weeks earlier, it would have made life a little bit easier through that process? It's more just any wishes that if anything kind of got to run differently from the context point of view, it would have helped matters.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, there were a lot of situations like that. I mean, one aspect that was very defined was the data. So
Mm.
that made it easier than a lot of other projects that we do, because a lot of times we don't have the data, or we don't have a full set of the data, or the data needs to be cleaned up, or
Mm.
it's not, so we'll start projects where we have to figure that out, and we kind of
Yeah.
have to build without that knowledge. So I mean, the election data is super clean, it's polished, it's historical, it all makes sense, it all goes together. And is a whole team that handles that, and they just give us a feed,
Got
right?
you.
Like no vendor is touching the data,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's very tightly kept.
Yeah.
So I think that was a huge asset, and just like took a lot of the pressure and weight off of us, because also what we're presenting from on the data front is not our responsibility. And
Mm.
if it's not wrong,
Yeah. Yeah.
you can trust it. So that was kind of cool. But as far as like, we built a lot of different visualizations that I think Herman showed some of them at the Outlier conference that got thrown out, right? Because we were having fun and we were like, oh, this will be cool, this will be interesting,
Yeah.
and then it's like, okay, well, what does the audience actually need to know, right?
Yeah.
So it's pretty simple what they need to know at a base level, like what we would call like the most common user
Mm.
journeys. For the more edge cases, that was more of, what if this happens, right? What if this
Mm.
happens on election night? What if there's a runoff? What if there, we had we did build in the feature for outstanding vote, right? So that Steve could present, okay, this is how much of the vote we're waiting on, right? So there were a lot of features like that, and a lot of indicators to the users at
Yeah.
home, that they could even see that if he wasn't even talking about that necessarily, right? So yeah, I think the biggest thing that we changed frequently, and that was a bit stressful, was where he would touch and where he would access things, right?
Right.
So
Okay.
we're trying, so you know, originally we had, for example, like I'll just use one example. In the title bar, we had that as a drop down, right? So he could access historical data that way. So they used that for a while, but then I don't even remember the reason, but they wanted that changed.
Right.
So there was a lot of that testing and figuring out what, you know, he could
Mm,
where he could remember to find which things, because
mm,
you have to realize like this guy is doing this in 30 seconds, you
yeah.
know? So a lot of the hits other than election night are 30 seconds, 60 seconds.
Yeah.
Even the ones on election night are too. But he's on TV for a lot longer. So there were a lot of those things back and forth. But I would say for that, you know, we none of us knew, you know, it was all new to everybody as far as
Absolutely
that
right.
went.
And you know, the
So
going back to the kind of broadcast delivery, there is a physical situation as well in terms of I guess, think about the angle of the screen, the positioning of where he is
yes.
anchored to, the arm reach, radius.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the kind of classic, I guess, interactive design motto of minimize the clicks to get from A to B, that sort of thing. You don't want to bring up a pop-up that obfuscates the thing that you're also trying to show the details of. So there seems to be a lot of sort of a physical juggling act that you can understand why there was a lot of almost, I guess, A/B testing where, does this work? Okay, let's try something else. Does this work? And I guess you have to just, perhaps as a group, just sort of perhaps chill out a little bit and say, right, we know this round is not necessarily going to be the final version, but we need to get through this to get to the final version. So patience and tolerance, I guess, is a motto that you have to kind of keep and observe. But I'm just thinking again about the knowns. You know, this is, as I said before, you've got a certain sense of fixed nature, the regions, the geographic components of the electoral structure. You've got probably a sense of the tolerance between what's the highest number of votes that might be counted from a certain region versus the lowest. I'm thinking now about the range of chart designs and how wide something may occupy, how big a bar will get, the margin of victory. You know, at worst it's going to be 100% to 0%, but that's unlikely. So you can sort of bring your scales back in. But I guess the biggest unknown is the when it will all play out. And you talked there about the votes outstanding. And I think it was Herman, or it might have even been a clip from Steve that sort of says that's kind of where the story is, because that's where you can most reasonably almost sort of fill the airtime with not just idle speculation, but informed speculation. So I guess that's perhaps the most, I don't know, almost like the exciting part of how the tool serves the process of the night. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, definitely. So Steve would be able to go click on a state, go into a state. We had a feature called the leaderboard. So the leaderboard shows all the candidates. Another feature discussion was if they don't fit on the screen, like what do we do? Do we have a scroll? Do we shrink
Yeah,
them? You know, so there is like every single intricacy that you can
yeah,
think of when you're building an app came up in this app. Um, so, you know, so that's just like as I'm thinking through like the user case that we did back
yeah,
then, that I'm thinking about it. And then within that, you know, he could click out the like during election night, okay, these are the votes outstanding. And he would say, okay, well, here we see in this count, the votes outstanding are mostly from this county. This county is, you know, 70% Democratic, 30% Republican. Obviously, we don't know what's, you know, who's going to vote, but like odds are this is going to go
mm,
Democratic, this county. So, and if that person wins, then this is going to happen, right?
right,
So we wanted to make sure he could tell that story on a granular level for every case.
yeah,
So I think having that election-based knowledge from the staff there was so helpful in order for us to make sure that we were doing that right.
yeah,
And doing that in a way that was, you know, as honest as possible for the audience and
mm,
as true at that moment as it could be. So we did focus a lot on making sure we were creating those types of graphics that were, the guy in the bar could see,
Exactly
right?
right.
So
Yeah.
I think both outstanding. It's just like a percentage and a bar, things like that.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, it was fascinating to get into that level of detail.
And just a final point before we get into some of the design choices around the sort of user research that you did. And again, we've got this nuance
Mm.
of the user is just the user who's using it to then broadcast to an audience. Obviously, you're talking about a guy who's experienced, who's got, a deep knowledge of the subject and the data and the things that he would want to say, the things that he can imagine wanting to say. Were there things that you were able to unlock for him that, I don't know, surprised him or were, sort of delightful extra features that I never thought you could do that, but that's brilliant. Were there any sort of those things, or was he so on top of his own needs and the scope of what's possible that it was just a nice sort of kind of, it was like a glove fitting a hand perfectly. He knew what he wanted, and that was such a kind of a complete list in a sense, like a complete wish list.
Yeah, I think both things happened and were true in a way. So he has that knowledge like inside his head. It's shocking. So he'll say, okay, in this state, Trump won by this many points. Like he knows
Wow.
every election and who won by how many points. It's wild. So what he used to do before he had our map was he would just draw the numbers on the screen. He would just circle the state or point to the
Mm.
county, like with the telemetry, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So telemetry. And so we were trying to get him to do that less, but he really likes to do it, so he still does it a lot. Um but we were able to create different ways for him to show that data and not have to pull it out of his head, right? So
Yeah,
for like I had already mentioned the historical drawer, right? So instead of just writing the numbers up on the screen over the state, he can just pull it out and the
yeah,
percentages are all there.
yeah.
And then it's stacked in a horse race. So it's done whoever won, right?
Right.
So you can just very easily see who won. Um, so I think he did, that was a very popular feature. Everybody loved that and he
Mm.
loved it and he used it a lot. I think one thing that was complicated to do was to go to different races. So to jump around kind of.
Got
So
you.
how do we get him from talking about the Senate race from, you know, whatever 2020 to, well, it wasn't 2020 because we were 2018 when we did this,
Yeah,
but you know what I mean? The Senate race
yeah.
from 2020 to like the governor race in whatever year, right?
Right.
2016. So that was a challenge because he does like to hop around a lot as
Yeah,
far as telling a story, because in his head he's like, oh, these statistics matter for this story that we're telling and who might win this race and why they might win this race. And so figuring that user journey out was a little complicated. So I think the glove didn't necessarily fit totally perfectly for that, but for the most common stories, it
mm.
did. And he was really like, our goal was to make sure he could easily get to the information that he wanted to get to, which is our goal for every project.
Right. But I think
So
that's
yeah.
in a sense that's it's not the only measure of success, but in a sense, if he's had a seamless experience delivering his expertise, in a sense, that is the most immediate success measure. Yeah. He didn't sort of have a moment of go, right, where do I press for this? Or which one do I go for? I can't find where I am. If that's not happening, then that's probably a decent a decent kind of guide to success happening in front of you. Just moving on
Yeah,
to the go ahead.
that did happen a lot at the beginning.
Right, okay.
But then we worked out the kinks and it ended up being like
Well,
much more seamless. Yeah.
absolutely right. Just moving on to some of the design choices, and obviously we've got
Sure.
many people listening rather than seeing this, but we will, for the video people, put some stills up. But can you just sort of
Yes.
run through some of the headline sort of visualization techniques that we use? So I guess the ceremonial centerpiece of all this is the map, the kind of red, blue, and a little bit of yellow, I think at times. Choropleth map. which is the centerpiece. And I guess it makes sense to be the centerpiece because it's what's driving so much of the story is the where, and then from there you can get into other stuff. But what other sort of charts did you use? And then we'll go on to some of the kind of ones that were perhaps thrown away that you wish they could have used.
Yes. So we had just a simple bar graph for the race to 270 for the presidential,
Right.
which is like very common, and that's like easy to use, easy to access. We have the what if scenario. So
Okay.
I think that was a really fun one to do. So Steve has all the states that are up, for election. And then what if this person wins? It's
Okay.
Republican if this person wins. And then we have the horseshoe, which is the Senate.
Yeah.
So that's like a very common one. So there are a lot of other graphs than the map. We ended up doing a bunch of line graphs. We did census. I think Shirley Wu was freelancing with us for at one point, and she
Fantastic.
did these really cool census maps, but they were deemed like hard for the audience to understand.
Right. Interesting.
But census data was something that Steve was really passionate about and really wanted to use and incorporate, along with polling data. So bringing in these different data sources was something that we tried to do, but it wasn't necessarily that it was nixed for like any reason that was like that was okay, these aren't good visuals. It was just not the centerpiece, not the focus of what we were trying to create and the insights we were trying to communicate. The map was obviously the most important, and making sure that the map was functional at every level.
Yeah.
Figuring out how to have the map be able to zoom in, then also like click to drill down into counties or congressional districts, which that information had to be layered. You had to have like the Senate map, all the races,
Yeah.
the House, and all of that. So so we did a lot of different graphs, but the main ones that we used were those ones: the what if, the road to 270, the map, and then we created some that got a lot that got ditched, right? So the line charts got ditched. The polling, I think we did some donut charts. I
Right.
thought those were really cool. I'm gonna find this stuff and send it to you. The donut charts, I think those got thrown out
I
too.
think there's a fair few cartogram grid maps that I thought were interesting that they were kind of not used. Because I
The
think that
chiclets?
I can't remember the kind of the grid maps, the kind of cartogram version of the US. I thought they were quite
Yeah.
interesting because I think
Oh, yeah.
I wondered
The
if
cartograph.
I don't know, might it have almost been just a couple of years too early for that to be so commonly used everywhere that it wasn't seen as, I don't know. I mean, you can tell me if I'm wrong here, but is there a sense that that is abstracting the US geography so much that it's almost, I don't know, insulting to the to the geography of the country? What's the kind of big issue with that?
I honestly think the issue is that people can't use it and explore it themselves, and it needs to be communicated in a short period of time.
Right.
So, we were driven to tell more complex stories with different visuals because that's fun and exciting for us,
Yeah.
and we think that's cool, and we think that's interesting, and we think people should be able to understand it. And they really would understand it if they could use it themselves, right?
Yeah.
I think that disconnect of like, this is on a screen and one person is actually guiding the user through it. Steve certainly could do that. I just think that the higher ups had they're very risk averse, right? They
Yeah.
don't want to do anything to like rock the boat, and they don't want to lose viewers. So if you start showing a new visual and it's unfamiliar, the viewer does have to learn it, right? So as database people, we're used to seeing every type of chart under the sun, and we just automatically know what it's saying, right? But that's a really key important thing for us as practitioners to always check ourselves about, right? Especially if
100%.
we don't have access to the end user for some reason, right? If we don't have access to them It's really important to have other people weigh in or to get other stakeholder feedback on
Yeah.
that, or people that have knowledge or have done it before, because that is something that I find in our industry. We want to push the envelope, we want to try new cool stuff, right? Which is awesome, and we should keep doing that, but it might not necessarily work
Well,
for
that's
that
right.
specific
And especially for
audience.
something in this context, I always think back to the 538. I'm wanting to say maybe the 2012 or 2014. It was kind of early 2010s, but they did this thing like a hamburger, which was 3 levels of complexity or complicatedness in terms of visualizations. There was like
Mm.
just a basic burger that would give you just who's winning. Here's the numbers, and then the sort of mid-level burger, the sort of quarter pounder, that'd be a little bit more complex, a little bit more elaborated detail, and then the Big Mac was go to town. Here's all the visuals, all the kind of scatter plots, and all these different things to serve different interests. And it's
That's cool.
but that is a website where the people who are there want to be there and they've got their own choice. Whereas this is a broadcast, you're pushing something. As you said, it has to be a bit much more discerning choice about the methods used. But the other key thing which I found fascinating about the design choices concerns the colouring. Obviously, the red blue is a given, but I was fascinated to learn about the issues around grayscale and the issues around gradients of colours that just don't come across through the camera. Well, you've got you've got a screen level, you've got a camera level, you've got a recipient TV level. There's lots of different obstacles there for light to pass through. So just speak to some of the sort of juggling that you went through with the colours.
Yeah. So, well, one of the things that's interesting, not from our perspective, not, it's not something
Mm,
we did have to handle it, but the MSNBC team really did a lot of work on this. Was I think it was that midterms, there were so many Republican candidates that there were like not enough shades of red.
right.
Like we couldn't, we're like, this is too many. And so that was kind of a funny one. But regarding, we would get to go into the studio, right, and test out the app in the studio. So we'd have the whole team there, and I had no idea the complexity involved in the color contrast
Mm.
until I literally saw it being recorded and then saw what it looks like on the screen. And we're like, this has to change, this
Where's
has
it
to
gone?
change, this has to change. And so fortunately we had this guy Jason, and I can't remember his name right now. I'll have to find it and send it to you. He was in charge of election designs for stills, and had worked on the election designs for years and years and years. So he was a huge benefit to have because he knew all of that information,
Mm.
and he really gave us a lot of guidance with like, this will work, this won't work, we'll have to change this, these things won't go together. So it definitely was a huge diversion from how we're normally used to dealing with color. And it was challenging, because if they didn't look right through the screen, then we
Mm.
had to make modifications, and that
Mm.
might affect other aspects of the design. One thing that we did that was really kind of, I didn't love it at first, was we put a highlight around, so it would run around the congressional districts so that the user
Okay.
could see it. And I was thinking that doesn't look very good, like on the computer, but they could see it on
Right.
TV.
Okay.
So, I think, and it ended up working pretty well. So yeah, that was an aspect that I wasn't anticipating we would have to do a lot of
Mm.
work on. At that point I was thinking, oh, this app is pretty much ready to go.
Mm.
But there were modifications that had to be made based on that testing. And, of course we handled that fine. I just didn't see it coming.
Right. Yeah, and I think the other thing, and again, I think it's something either yourself or Herman spoke about this idea of sort of flat design. There's something about a lot of TV broadcast graphics that are 3D, decorative 3D.
Hmm.
They've got lens flare, they've got things that are moving so that the viewer gets a clue that their screen's not frozen. It has to kind of keep moving to look like it's a live a live graphic. You know, it feels like there wasn't any tension on this front, but were there any moments when they might have been pushing for something a little bit more, let's say, glitzy and perhaps old-fashioned TV broadcast graphic, whereas you were trying to keep things, flat and contrasting and contemporary and fresh? Or was that something that just didn't really materialize?
Yeah, that wasn't really an issue that came up because the way that they incorporated kind of whatever else they wanted to do and whatever else they wanted to show was through their existing design pipeline.
Right.
So if they wanted to put in a still or if they wanted to put in um like a specific graphic for like a point in time, they would have their artworks team create that. And then we incorporated a way for Steve to do like a slideshow.
Got you.
So he could move from the map to like a still, then another still, and then back to the map, right?
Right.
So that was built into the tool so that they could continually, and also if there's something that really solved for, okay, we need this to be presented tomorrow morning, right? So then it's like, okay, let's have artworks, poor artworks, let's have artworks do it,
Yeah, yeah.
But they were used to cranking like that. That's their jam,
Right, of course,
So
yeah.
so that kind of solved for that and didn't put the pressure on us to create anything in a kind of like in a silo or in a dated way. And I will say regarding like the flat design, we typically design a lot more like subtle.
Mm.
We don't have as much extreme
Ornate, yeah.
yeah. But we did have to do that so that it would resonate for the end viewer.
Got you.
I mean, I still think it looks really clean, but yeah.
Yeah, no, it certainly does. And the other thing I think that's interesting as well, we spoke about some of the charts you've used there. There's a lot that's not charts. There's a lot that's labels, that's statistics, that's
Yes.
numbers. And there's also in the broadcast, and correct me if I'm wrong, a kind of a chyron, I think is the technical term, the sort of ticker that's on the broadcast that's another layer of information that's completely detached and distinct from Steve and what he's doing on screen. This is another layer of information. How did that sort of dovetail with how the big screen was working? Did you have any input on that? Was that a separate track that at least had to be cohesive in look and feel, if not part of the same delivery?
Yeah, we didn't have anything to do with the ticker, and I think they changed the design of that pretty regularly.
Right.
But regarding labels, as you know, I've said for the past 10 years since I've been in this industry, labels are always the problem. And my staff used to tease me and say, if you ever write a book, it's going to be called Labels Are Always a Problem, which applies to like a lot of levels of life.
100%.
So yeah, I remember years and years ago when we were doing, pack layouts in D3 and the labels just kept bumping into each other and navigating that and figuring out how to like, how to label everything and to have it, because our one of our principles is like everything needs to be labeled. So yeah, so labeling was interesting for sure. And there are a lot of numbers on the screen, as you said. And I think, that's essential for the end user to be able to grasp that in a second amount of time. And then also the font size and all of that was a huge discussion with the labels because we had to fit a lot of stuff on the screen, but we don't want it to look cluttered. And, so there were a lot of those trade-offs that were discussed and into very, nitty gritty detail. But yeah, with labels, there's always a trade-off, so.
They've got to go somewhere. Absolutely.
Yeah, they've got to go somewhere. They got to be on that screen.
Now, we'll probably not have time to get into the mechanics of some of the sort of technologies and the build process, but I think it'd be nice to sort of jump to, I don't know, like launch night, election night. Where were you all? Were you on site? Were you there just at home with popcorn? Were you on site ready to support things if they went wrong? How did it kind of
Yeah,
manifest in terms
so
of the actual event itself?
they have in-house developers that are, basically like on call for anything. And EJ was one of them that midterm
Right.
election. We were not expected to do that, which I was happy about. But we had an election party and like we watched it and at points we were like, oh no, or we're like excited. So that was really fun and really cool to do. But it was really exciting. So we weren't at the studio for that. They had staff that's
Of course, yeah.
allocated for that. But that entire election team, I mean, they're there like for I can't even imagine the last election. Like they must have been so
It
beyond
was.
exhausted.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, like it was,
3 4 days.
yeah, yeah. And normally it's not that long.
Yeah.
So, and they work basically 24/7. Like they just, they're very committed. So, yes, so we weren't expected to do that. I think basically the guy who was in charge of our project and in charge of us, we're signing our contracts, is Mark Greenstein. And he's very realistic about like, okay, you guys are a vendor, and even though you've been very involved in this, like you don't need to be here
Yeah, of
you don't need
course.
to be on call for that,
That's good.
Um, yeah. So I think that was a really cool thing about this project is that it was such a team effort
Mm.
and working in tandem with them was a really positive experience. And I think sometimes when you go in as a vendor, um, there can be like contentions or there can
Yeah,
be
of
things that
course.
are the in-house staff is like, they don't want you there necessarily sometimes.
You're on their
Some
patch
people
and
do.
yeah.
Yeah, some people do, some people don't. But that wasn't the case here. It was like such a positive energy.
Well, I think my first question then to sort of wrap up in terms of reflections is already answered in terms of, was it enjoyable? Did you achieve what you set out? It clearly was in both cases.
Yes.
So let's get a bit more kind of, I don't know, detailed, finite. What was your kind of one highlight or your favorite moment, your favorite bit, the favorite feature? What if you could hold one thing up and say that was just such a delightful moment or thing? What would that thing be?
I mean, for me, it was just seeing it on election night and seeing
Right.
Steve
In the
like
wild.
on TV using our app with, you know, millions and millions of people watching
Yeah.
it. Um, I was like, this is so cool. I kind of can't believe that we made that, and that it's being used. Because, I think sometimes when you're building software, you can, especially if you're doing front end and you're doing, that's your main focus.
Mm,
You can build something and you hand it over to the in-house team, and then you don't necessarily know if it was successful or not if you don't
exactly.
email them in 6 months and say, hey, how's the product going? How's
Yeah.
it being used? Do you have any user feedback? Do you want any modifications made based on the user feedback? You might not even know if it gets used, And
Exactly.
so for this, it was such a reward to see it being used for years and years and years after. And of course, the in-house team, the digital team, did take the product over, and they deserve a lot of credit because
Yeah.
they maintained it, which is a huge, huge job.
Yeah.
And they fixed it and, made everything workable for the next election for Steve and for, so they deserve a lot of credit. They took over the app and ownership of it. So yeah, but I think just like seeing it used, seeing the same app and they didn't modify the design extremely being used for years and years to come is really rewarding.
And like 2024 is another election
Yes.
looming. What's any more involvement going forward, or is it, as you said, is it now just handed over and it's their baby now?
It's their baby. And I have to say, like, being a little less involved in the election has been less stressful from a personal perspective. Like, I
Yeah.
don't have to know everything these candidates are doing.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but I do from a citizen perspective need to be paying attention. But yeah, because we were working with them, I mean, nonstop, right? So it was like we knew everything that was going on in the news every single week, right? So that's a whole mental load that I'm not used to. So, but yeah, so we're not involved at this point. But you never know when they might call you.
Well, that's right. And what we'll see on screen will be very very significantly based on what we saw back in the 2018 and the 2020 version, and probably from other broadcasters as well, emulating the success. And as you said, it's a twofold thing. It's both the delivery, the on-air talent, and the tool that they're using. So it sounds like a really exciting and fulfilling experience. And from what I can see in the clips, it's been a very successful project. So it's been wonderful to learn about it. Thank you ever so much, Natalie, and credit to everyone else involved, Herman and the team. It's a testament to the quality of your work that it was so successful. So thank you for sharing that, and thank you to everyone out there watching, listening to another episode of Exploits Explained. We'll see you very soon for another episode. Thanks for now. To see more information about today's episode, including some links to key sites and resources mentioned, please visit my website at visualizingdata.com. Here you'll also be able to find details about my book, information about my public and private training courses, as well as over a decade of blog posts. If you've enjoyed this series, please consider liking, subscribing, and spreading the word. See you next time.